Welcome to the Unusual History of Everything, the podcast that uncovers the unusual history of everything around us. I'm Karen Lacey.
And I'm Melanie Dellis. On this episode, in honor of Thanksgiving, we thought we'd tell you how pumpkin pie became a Thanksgiving staple and how Mary Had a Little Lamb was connected to it.
The first Thanksgiving was celebrated in November 1621, when 50 of the surviving pilgrims and 90 people of the Wampanoag tribe sat down together and shared what they called an autumn harvest feast. Although relations between the colonists and the Native Americans were not always good, the Native Americans helped the colonists through a brutal winter by teaching them many things, including how to plant and harvest corn. Because of this, the governor, William Bradford, invited some of the Native Americans to a 3-day feast to celebrate. This happy celebration of thanks became a favorite tradition still celebrated today.
But we didn't always celebrate Thanksgiving like we do now. It wasn't even a national holiday until 1863, and that was in large part due to a tenacious woman named Sarah Josepha Hale. When Sarah was young, she married a man who, unfortunately, died after 9 years of marriage and 5 children. In order to keep her family from starving, she wrote poetry books, and her most famous one, Poems for Our Children, contained her biggest hit, Mary Had a Little Lamb.
In 1837, Sarah became editor of Godey's Lady's Book, an American woman's magazine, and her work there turned her into one of the most influential women in the 18th century. She wrote a column about everything that related to women, like children and proper gender roles. And although she did not support women's suffrage, she did support women's education and the rights of women as property owners. She also wrote about causes that were important to her, like abolishing slavery and fundraising for historic sites, like George Washington's home and the Bunker Hill Monument.
But it was in 1827 that she began a 36-year campaign to get Thanksgiving, which at the time was only celebrated in the Northeast, established as a national holiday. She wrote editorials in the magazine and sent letters to the presidents, governors, senators, and other politicians who, for the most part, ignored her, although they did nickname her the Mother of Thanksgiving. However, in 1863, President Lincoln decided to sign into action a National Day of Thanksgiving and Praise, in which he asked Americans to ask God to, quote, commend to his tender care all those who have become widows, orphans, mourners, or sufferers in the lamentable civil strife, and to heal the wounds of the nation, end quote.
President Lincoln declared that the last Thursday in November would be Thanksgiving Day, and it stayed like that until 1939, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt moved it up a week to try to get people to shop more during the Great Depression. That, however, did not fly with very many people, and he ended up moving it back to its original date, and there it stayed. Sarah Hale, by the way, retired from her work at the magazine when she was 90, and unfortunately passed away 2 years later, but her hard work lives on.
Let's go back to the first Thanksgiving feast back in 1621 and talk about the food, which was much different than what we make today. Back then, the main food would have been mussels, lobster, clams, venison, and some sort of bird like duck, goose, or even swan. And because the pilgrims didn't have ovens or even much sugar, pies and cakes were likely not on the table. So how then did pumpkin pie become a tradition?
Well, it all started in Central America circa 5500 BC, which is when and where pumpkins were first cultivated. The first European explorers to the New World brought them back home around 1536, and soon they were grown regularly in England. They weren't called pumpkins, though. They were called pompons.
I think it's pompions.
Maybe. Pompions, I like that. After the French word pompon, which referenced the gourd's roundness. The Americans, however, eventually called them pumpkins.
Or like me, I call them pumpkins.
Me too. Oh, little pumpkin.
England had for centuries been making sweet and savory stuffed pastries and pies, but when the Pilgrims had their first Thanksgiving feast, they didn't have much sugar or an oven, like we said, so cooking like that was not an option. Pumpkins were familiar to the Wampanoag tribe, so it's likely they were on the table in some form, just not as a pie. But there is written evidence that they were made into pies at least by 1653, just not like we do them today. A French cookbook recipe, for example, calls for boiling the pumpkin in milk, straining refining it and then putting it into a crust. Yeah, we should try that.
We should totally try that. In 1670, English writer Hannah Wolsey suggested pies that were layered with pumpkin, apple, spiced rosemary, sweet marjoram, and thyme. Sounds much more appetizing than her famous health food recipe, by the way, for snail water. I totally want to try that pie as well. Let's do that one too.
Okay, I thought you were going to say I totally want to try snail water.
No, not the snail water, right? In her recipe book, The Queen-like Closet, Wolsey suggests drinking snail water to treat and possibly prevent consumption, better known as tuberculosis. Snail water, dear listeners, is basically wine or beer that contains crushed snails, mashed earthworms, and a lot of medicinal herbs.
Yum.
No, thank you. Let's go back to that pie. That pie sounds good with the apple and the rosemary.
I know, that does sound good. We should try that one too. Going back to those pies, without snails, might I add, sometimes there wasn't even a crust. They would just hollow out a pumpkin, fill it with spiced, sweetened milk, then cook it over a fire. It wasn't until the 1700s that pumpkin pie, more like we know it now, was on the Thanksgiving table. In fact, it became such an important part of the dinner that in 1705, the people of Colchester, Connecticut, postponed Thanksgiving for a week because they didn't have enough molasses to make the pies.
It became very important. Very important.
It's like having cannolis at Christmas. If you don't have the ingredients to make the cannoli, I don't know if we'd postpone Christmas, but I would definitely postpone the party until I get the cannoli ingredients.
I could see that. Well, remember Sarah Josepha Hale, who worked tirelessly to have Thanksgiving become a national holiday?
Yes, I do.
Well, she also had a little something to do with pumpkin pie being part of that tradition. She featured it in her 1827 anti-slavery novel, Northwood, in which she described a Thanksgiving table full of desserts with the pumpkin pie occupying the place of honor. But making the pie was time-consuming and expensive. So in 1929, Libby's meat canning company out of Chicago came up with a canned pumpkin that changed everything. No longer did people have to roast and strain the gourd. Now, they could open a can and pour it into a homemade crust. Oh my gosh, it is true. I've never made it the traditional way.
No,
I've always made it
have
from
I.
a can at this point.
Exactly. It's
makes
better.
sense.
It's just better.
It's just faster.
It's faster.
It's faster.
Well, in my case, it's better. We don't normally spend time thinking about where the things we are so used to came from or how they were changed to make our lives today so much easier, but we should. This year, as we sit down to eat with our families and friends, we should spend a moment being thankful for the people of the past, the centuries of industrialists, writers, housewives, chefs, and agriculturalists who have given us cans of food and have made possible so many other culinary creations, except maybe just not that snail water. I'm not thankful for that.
And we should also take a moment to just thank all the people who have just contributed to Thanksgiving, not just with the food, but just kind of like the moments of time throughout history where people have come together to just help one another, even when they didn't have to. And I really like that idea, and being with your family and friends is really what I think about when I think of Thanksgiving.
Well, that helping each other. That goes back to the first Thanksgiving.
It does. I just like people helping one another, even when they don't have to. Those are my favorite kinds of stories.
And despite all of the horrible things that are going on, they help each other anyway.
Yeah.
I like that too.
Well, that brings us to the end of our episode. You can follow the Unusual History of Everything podcast on Instagram at The Unusual History of Everything and on Facebook at The Unusual History of Everything podcast. Find our show notes on www.musecuratorial.com. The Unusual History of Everything is written, produced, and directed by Melanie Dellis and Karen Lacey.
New episodes air every Tuesday on all podcast outlets. Be sure to subscribe to us so you never miss an episode and leave us a review. You can also see photos from our episodes and more on our website, Instagram, and Facebook. Thanks for listening. I'm Melanie Dellis.
And I'm Karen Lacey, your host for The Unusual History of Everything.
Da, da, da.